Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 22nd, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who support Talk Nerdy week after week. Remember, it is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep this train on the tracks is, like, at this point, not from ad sales at all. It's really just from listener support from individuals just like yourself. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharadwaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. We are 1 week post eclipse. I had an incredible time. I was very lucky. I went with the folks from The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and we did a bunch of shows, like live stage shows in Dallas, Texas. And then we observed the eclipse from our hotel in the suburbs of Dallas in DeSoto. The weather report was really not good. And even that morning, there was so much cloud cover. There was a storm rolling in. So we were quite worried. But luckily, the clouds parted, I'd say about 15 minutes maybe before totality. And then they stayed, the sky stayed beautiful and clear and black throughout totality. And then after, nice and blue for almost the whole second half of the eclipse. So we were really, really lucky that I got to have that experience for the second time, and that the folks I was there with, many of whom it was their first time to ever observe an eclipse, I kind of got to see it through their eyes. So very lucky, very grateful for the opportunity. And I'd love to hear from any of you who also saw the eclipse, and maybe it was your first time. I'd love to hear what it was like for you. All right, so we are going to dive into an episode that I actually recorded some time ago. But we've been waiting for it to kind of coincide with the release of her book. So coming out on April 18th, 2024, is Solitude, the Science and Power of Being Alone. So I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Netta Weinstein, who is one of 3 co-authors on this book. She is a professor of psychology and a director of the European Research Council's Solitude, Alone but Resilient, also called the SOAR project. And her research focuses on motivation and well-being, and of course, the what comes from spending time alone and how powerful it can be. So I was really excited when this book came across my desk, because I definitely am a maybe self-described alone person, like alone but not lonely. I really do enjoy spending a lot of time alone and having time to myself, having my own space. And what was always, maybe not always, but what has long historically been seen as a negative, I think for many of us is actually quite a positive. And so I was very excited to talk to Dr. Weinstein all about it. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Netta Weinstein. Well, Netta, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I am excited to talk about your new book, Solitude, the Science and Power of Being Alone, that you actually co-wrote with, I am definitely not going to be able to pronounce the last name, but with Heather Hansen, and maybe you can help us out.
Tweevy Nguyen.
Tweevy. Okay, Tweevy Nguyen. And this book, so you are the psychologist on the book. So that's my take on this, right? You've got sort of a psychologist, a science writer, and actually also a psychologist. So two psychologists and a science writer.
We're 2 psychologists and a science writer turned psychologist.
Turned I didn't even realize that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's very cool. So you all collectively are interested in this topic and decided to get together to write this book.
Absolutely. And do a lot of great research together as well.
That's amazing. And so tell me a little bit before we dive into the topic, which is so, I think, personally important to me. Like when your book came across my desk, sometimes I'm like, yeah, that's a good fit for the show. That's a good fit for the show. And other times I'm like, that is a good fit for me. And that is why I want to talk about this. So this one is especially, I think, very personally interesting and motivating. But before we get into the topic, I do love to give listeners a little bit of background on you personally. So you are a psychologist and you are in the UK. Tell me a little bit about sort of how you got to where you are as you're a research psychologist, right?
Yes, yeah.
How you got to where you are and sort of what some of the areas of inquiry you tend to focus on.
Yeah, so I am a research psychologist. Many years ago, I was a useful clinical psychologist as well. And one of the things I learned was how important it is to be strong within ourselves, to have resilience, to be able to deal with our emotions, to be able to understand ourselves. And so, kind of working with clients at the time, that was our goal. And the way that we did that was through social support, through the role of the therapist to really help people to discover themselves. And for many, many years, I identified as a relationship researcher. So my areas in motivation and well being. And I was really interested in how relationships with other people help us to be empowered, help us to feel supported, help us to understand ourselves. And I thought kind of the best social relationships are the ones where we leave knowing who we are, feeling close to ourselves, feeling like we can express ourselves. And that was a lot of my research for a long time. And, there was a certain point where I started thinking about this other time in our lives, time in our everyday lives that we spend on our own. And what does it mean to support ourselves, to be empowered when we're on our own? Can we sort of be our own sources of strength? Or does that kind of strength always come from other people?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because, of course, there are these sort of common factors and common ingredients when you study psychology, when you work. I'm now working in clinical psychology, as you previously did. Um, there are these sort of common things that you come back to that are really kind of predictive, I guess you could say, of positive outcomes. And social support, having a really strong social network, whether that be friends, family members, or just individuals that you can sort of lean on and that lean on you, is really, really predictive of these positive outcomes. But I don't think we talk enough about what solitude or what not loneliness, but aloneness looks like. And how that can actually be, I think, a really important indicator. We often look at being alone in the negative. We talk about the loneliness epidemic, but we never kind of focus, or I shouldn't say never, I think plenty of us do focus on this, but it doesn't seem to be the general narrative that strength in solitude, that taking the time to be introspective and meditative and to work on oneself and just to exist with your own thoughts in a quiet setting is actually very healthy and joyful.
I completely agree with that. I think we tend to forget solitude is an important part of our lives. And, there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that we are social creatures. And I think we can all agree on that. We evolve to be in social settings, we evolve to seek social settings. And actually, a lot of the way that we're socialized, how we kind of learn to be a functional member of society, that happens in social settings. And historically, that's been within the family structure, the community structure, religious organizations, educational organizations. So when we think about solitude as this kind of rebellious place where society's not acting on us, we're acting on ourselves and we can kind of find our independence. I think there's potentially something a little threatening in that for society. What does it mean when people can go off on their own and come up with their own ideas about how to behave or what's moral or immoral? So we have this history of having an uncomfortable relationship with solitude, which I think to this day influences our sort of willingness to embrace it as something that's an opportunity in our lives. I think that a lot of that history and also the way we talk about solitude. So when we think about, solitude as an opportunity, we tend not to go there in our minds. We tend to think about solitude isolation as something that feels lonely. Even the word for solitude, until very recently, was used interchangeably as the word loneliness. So when we talked about solitude, it can be I'm in my solitude. That also means I'm lonely, I'm isolated. There's a negative connotation to the word solitude in the English language. And even when we look at languages across the world today, what we're often finding is that solitude and loneliness don't have two separate words. There isn't such a thing as positive solitude that has that one word associated with it. When we use the word solitude, we also mean loneliness at the same time. So in our minds, it's quite difficult to separate them.
It's interesting. I am reminded of an interview I did here on the show right around 1 year ago now, with Dr. Brian Lowry, who's a psychology professor at Stanford. And he wrote a book about the self. I'm just looking it up now. It's called Selfless, The Social Creation of You. And we talked a lot about identity and and like intersubjectivity, and how sort of the creation that we continuously make throughout our lives of the concept of self, of who we are, is often in relationship to other people, right? Oftentimes when we talk about the hats we wear, or like, what are you? Who are you? We list things like, oh, I'm a friend, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm a whatever. We talk about our work, but our work almost always involves other people. And so I think there is this really complex interplay, but it's almost like, mm, maybe you won't like this analogy, so I'm curious what you think about it. But it's almost like you can't see the words on the page unless there's the empty spaces between them. There's sort of the foreground and the background. When we talk about the fact that we as individuals, or even our concept of who we are, develops in a social setting, we are still individuating that whole time. And we are still kind of spending time with ourselves in order to reflect on what that means and in order to develop. It's like we can't have one without the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot there, and when we think about development, we are developing in a social world, and a lot of the relationships in our lives, the time we spend with others, that's a lot of what defines and shapes and forms us. And I think few psychologists would argue with that. One of the kind of fascinating things from psychodynamic theorists who talked about that socialization process, and D.W. Winnicott is one psychoanalyst who I think is absolutely fantastic. And he really talked about social environments that support who we really are. But what he said is that when we're in those social environments, it also helps us to build the capacity to be on our own. That is, to understand ourselves as well as independent beings, and not necessarily dependent on or reliant on people always being there. So social environments and solitude spaces actually really influence one another. They don't sort of live as two separate experiences in our lives. And really supportive, empowering social environments could help us to build stronger solitude. And potentially stronger solitude can help us to then be our best selves when we go out to the social world.
I 100% agree with that concept. And it's funny because personally I am trained in a more existential orientation, and obviously I use a lot of different modalities when I practice, but like that is sort of how I often am conceptualizing the world and am conceptualizing patients and myself. And the the sort of solitude piece, the aloneness, not the loneliness, but the aloneness piece is so deeply a part of the existentialist um, kind of ideas, like this concept that nobody can birth your birth for you, nobody can die your death for you. You are, although in a social setting, you are constantly navigating the world and making decisions that ultimately you're responsible to. And ultimately, you are living with the consequences of those things. Like nobody else can carry those burdens for you. when it comes down to brass tacks. And so this idea of being alone with yourself, it's almost like the greatest source of anxiety for a lot of people, but it can also be the greatest source of like equanimity, I think.
That's absolutely right. I think the thing that makes solitude most appealing for some people or sometimes is also what makes it most difficult, which is we don't have other people to guide us, to distract us, to tell us what we should be thinking about or what should be we be focusing on. So when we're alone, we focus on our own thoughts, our own experiences. We have the space to do that. And that means that we can learn a lot about ourselves. And that can be a wonderful, connecting, empowering experience. But it can also be a very scary or empty or boring experience if we're not ready or willing to be in that space.
Hmm. Yeah, it can be really overwhelming. And I think that psychotherapy can be a huge help for that kind of a thing, is sort of supporting somebody as they enter into that space. Because the truth of the matter is there are times when we're all forced to be alone, but that doesn't mean that we're actually embracing what it means to be in solitude. There are plenty of people who might be spending time at home alone, but they are, constantly on their phones, surrounded by the feeds of other people. They're constantly being entertained, watching television, or, just doing things that prevent them from sitting with their own thoughts.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. What we found, so a lot of our research has started from interviews with people. A lot of what we know about solitude today comes from descriptions that people shared about their time alone and their best times and their worst times alone. And one of the things that we found is that there are different ways to be in solitude. When we think about solitude, often we're thinking about that Buddha style solitude. We're sitting, kind of finding enlightenment. And sitting alone with your thoughts is in a way, for some researchers and some theorists, kind of the purest form of being alone. But a lot of our everyday solitude is distracted solitude. It might be watching television, it might be doing chores or baking a cake. It doesn't mean that uh, it doesn't offer us an opportunity to have time with ourselves, to have our own thoughts. And even reading a book or watching television, we can actually turn to our own thoughts. But for some people, that space, when we do have a pause in the show, when we're sort of left to really reflect deeply on things, can be quite difficult. And that idea of that pure solitude, I'm going to really reflect on how I'm feeling and how I'm thinking, that can feel overwhelming to some. And it doesn't take being a Buddha, actually, or even having a lot of psychotherapy, to think about shaping or creating a different relationship for ourselves with our solitude time. So I think one of the things that I learned in doing the research that I've been doing on solitude over, the past number of years, is that actually everyday solitude is something that's more attainable than we might think. And even for those people who are a little suspicious of their solitude time, or not particularly excited by going into this pure solitude and really reflecting, that finding little moments to practice and kind of build that muscle of, being able to be with oneself, to listen to oneself and connect to oneself, that just finding those little moments can help us get a different relationship with solitude and become more comfortable with it.
It's really interesting thinking about what it means to spend those moments alone and become comfortable in those moments. And so much of, I think, our relationship with, whether it be solitude or anything really, our relationship with food or our relationship with aging or our relationship with anything, has to do, I think, with like scarcity and gratitude. I'm reminded of the fact that one of my best friends in the whole world, she recently had a baby, and she has no solitude, right? Like this kid is completely attached to her. She can't go to the bathroom without the child, kind of like at her feet. And I am in so many ways her equal and opposite. I am, in some ways I would say the narrative is that I am not normative, but I think I represent something that is increasingly becoming normative, which is that I am a single, child-free, 40-year-old woman who owns my own home and who has just so much opportunity for solitude. And so I think about my friend and how she's just desperate for alone time. And, she probably looks at my life and is like, oh, I just wish. But then I look at other people who might be in my position and they struggle with spending this much time alone because they feel lonely and all they want is a little bit more engagement and interaction. I quite like it. Like, this is the world that I want to be in. But it is really interesting how often you are craving what it is you don't have enough of.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the fascinating things, and us researchers are really just learning so much about solitude now, and there's so much still that we have to learn. But one of the fascinating things that we could keep coming back to is that, the trick to really great solitude is finding a balance between our solitude and our social time. And for almost all of us, we need some of both. The amount, whether it's a lot of solitude or almost no solitude, but maybe just a few moments here or there, that's for each individual to decide. I think it's quite different for each individual. And we had a research study actually where we set out to find the ideal amount of time that we should spend. Let's do a one size fits all solution. We can prescribe everybody, let's say, 2 hours of solitude every day, and their lives are going to be perfect. So we set out to kind of find this ideal balance between solitude and social time. And there really wasn't one at all. You'll be surprised to hear. And instead, we found that people had very kind of different ideas of what the ideal amount of time that they would spend in solitude, whether it's a little bit or a lot. In their daily lives. And of course, that's not just me across my lifespan, but they'll be very different at different times in my life. Sometimes life throws us out of balance. So we saw people thrown out of balance during COVID lockdowns when, actually initially people were generally fine with it. We and other researchers were surprised to see in the early months, people didn't feel so isolated and lonely. But as time passed and we continued to be out of balance, that cumulative, I'm stuck in solitude and I can't get out of it, made solitude a difficult and lonely experience for especially those who were living alone. And parenthood is the opposite. Parenthood throws you into endless social interaction, and it's a specific type of kind of giving, attentive, high need social interaction. I'm a parent, so I really resonate with that experience. And I think then in those times in our lives, solitude becomes a really wonderful opportunity, a resource, and keeps us sane to even have short periods of solitude time every day. So I remember for me, 10 or 15 minutes alone, just kind of breathing and not doing anything, not talking to anybody. That was a beautiful experience at that time in my life. So we do have that balance, and there isn't, a sort of right and wrong about what that balance could look like for everybody. There's a different amount of time that they would like to be with themselves or be interacting with others.
It's interesting too that obviously I think that this parallels so many aspects of psychology and psychology research and really sociology as well, is this idea that there are individual differences, there are general trends, that there's in some ways more that sort of combines us than that separates us as people. But that when you start to get into the variance, we do tend to sometimes, not always, but sometimes see trends that divide along different, let's say, demographic lines. So you mentioned earlier, like lifespan development. And I'm reminded of this concept of like gerotranscendence, this idea that sort of the older we get, for some people, the less interested we are in keeping up with the trends and sort of knowing what the hot new music and the hot new fashions are. And we don't really know the name of that actor or actress anymore, but we are spending more time alone, taking long walks, thinking, about the existential, like what it all means kind of questions, and really valuing our alone time. So for some people, that increases as they get older. But I'm also reminded of like cultural differences, gender differences. And so I'm curious if you've seen any interesting trends in your research that have to do with those different kinds of demographic variables.
Yeah. So both age and gender actually play a really interesting role in solitude. Age is a really fascinating one because when we look at sort of public policy and things like that, we tend to worry about loneliness in older adulthood. And I think that's a very legitimate thing to worry about. But actually, if you look at older adults in solitude, they have the best time.
Yeah.
All things being equal, older adults are best at taking advantage of their solitude time. And I think, if we look at the research broadly on, how we change as we age, when we go from kind of middle adulthood to older adulthood, one of the things that happens is we start to prioritize certain relationships in our lives. And we have less of this need to constantly be interacting with everybody. And there's a shift to go from a lot of, let's say, more superficial relationships to really doubling down on the meaningful relationships and the meaningful conversations in our lives. And what that essentially means is, it doesn't take constant conversation for someone, all things being equal, for someone who's older to have well being or happiness. They have more space and time for solitude. And what the research is pretty consistently showing is that older adults feel more peaceful when they're in solitude. They're more comfortable in that time. They can take more advantage of it. They feel more autonomous, like they can be who they are in it. And so, I like to think as we mature and become wiser, we're really able to take advantage of our solitude time and we enjoy it more.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious about, gender as well, and maybe this is sort of the feminist in me, or the person who has really found a lot of self-efficacy in and pride in attaining certain things as a woman that historically society, and I mean still to some extent society is structured to kind of like disallow it, but historically, like I wouldn't have been able to get a loan for my own home. And I was just reading an article the other day that like there was active legislation to prevent women from sitting alone and eating in restaurants, like up until the 70s. And so you look at these structures of society where women were meant to be dependent on male providers, and there was sort of an expectation of that, and that's still there to a large extent, but we've been working really hard to overcome it. I see research all the time that shows that sort of like unmarried, child-free women rate the happiest. Like the most joyful in their lives, and I definitely can vouch for some of that. I'm like, here, I'm one of those people. They never actually interviewed me for these studies, but I feel very privileged and blessed that I can enjoy my solitude whenever I want, and that I ultimately have control over when I give my time to others, when I engage with others, and when I get to recharge and really focus on kind of self-care. And so I'm curious what kind of gender differences you've seen, because the research also strangely shows that married men tend to be happier than unmarried men.
hmm Yeah. So, I think solitude's kind of, I have to admit, I was a bit of a feminist before I became a solitude researcher, but I think being a solitude researcher has made me even more of a feminist.
Mhm.
um,
Yep.
and I think there's a kind of fascinating history of solitude for men that is different from the history of solitude for women. And when you look back at kind of the big solitude heroes in our past, many of them are spiritual leaders. I talked about the Buddha, religious figures in general, and we kind of bring to mind monks or hermits as sort of people who really got solitude down. They really know how to use that time. Those figures tended to be men. So it wasn't only men who spent time in sort of extended isolation, but those tend to be the kind of images that we think about. And women historically have had a much more difficult time having their solitude supported by society. And if you think about the role of men and women in society, men were maybe out in the farm. They had the opportunity to explore. They had the opportunity for solitude, and they could often be in solitude and still contribute to society. Women were generally expected to be at home taking care of the kids in a social environment. And even when you look at 15th century medical recommendations, they often talked about the dangers of solitude for women, that women's minds sort of can't handle solitude, or they might have impure or immoral thoughts
Oh,
if they're
geez.
left alone too much. We don't
Yeah.
want that. And women historically haven't had a lot of support for that kind of solitude. Women who liked solitude tended to often live sort of on the edges of society. And even now, when we look at research in solitude with men and women, I do think the eating alone research is one of the coolest places to see this. Is that women do struggle to feel comfortable in solitude. When women imagine eating alone in a restaurant, they have a harder time feeling comfortable in that space. They feel like they're judged by others. And
Well, they
I
probably
think
are. I mean, that you
they
think
very
about
well
the
might
fact,
be,
yeah, that our
exactly.
society didn't even allow it until recently. Like, what kinds of stigmas are people carrying around with that?
So I think that is very much, in the back of the minds of women. And again, we can kind of think back to parents of young children and babies. When you sort of ask moms tend to be the ones that we see really needing solitude the most, especially insofar as they're the primary caregivers, and they're staying home in those early months or the early year. Um, they need that solitude time, but there's a lot of guilt around taking time to be alone, that sense that I don't deserve that time, that there's something selfish about it. So it isn't that men are immune from those kinds of thoughts, but I think women are wired a little bit to think that way about solitude.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other things I wanted to bring up was some of the research that I've seen lately, or just the conversation I've seen lately around these gendered like hobbies. And so obviously, again, like I mentioned, I live alone and I'm allowed to kind of do whatever I want whenever I want. But for my friends who are married, living with their partners, and oftentimes they also have children, I notice that the male hobby, the husband or the father's hobby, takes him out of the home and allows him a lot of social or kind of solitude engagement. So whether it's like being out in the garage working on his car for a few hours, or whether it's going to the golf course with his friends for like all day, or going hunting or going fishing. Whereas like the women's hobbies are usually very domestic in nature. So they're things like crafting. They're things that allow them to still be providing childcare or homemaking, and keep them around the home. And they really don't get a lot of kind of in these classic and traditional roles, a lot of alone time.
Mm. So I think I want to argue with you a little bit about that,
Please,
because
yes, thank you.
I think we tend to assume that solitude is at its finest when we're out kind of hunting or out in the wilderness. And there is something to that. I'm somebody who loves nature and who loves to be out on my own in nature. It's one of my, if I can imagine how I want to spend my time, that's really one of my top kind of top ways to be in solitude. But there are a lot of ways that we can have our solitude time. And one of the things that we found is that when people are even with their partners in the room, that they can still feel that they're in solitude or be in solitude if there's a sort of agreement that we're not going to be interacting or talking to one another. So we hear stories about people reading with their partners in the room, and each one is in their own psychological space. And that feels very much like solitude. And when we look at things like hobbies that have to do with baking or crafting or gardening, those are opportunities for solitude as well. So that doesn't mean that there aren't these sort of different gender norms, or that women should not be encouraged to go out and go on kind of wilderness retreats or go long distance hiking. I think that kind of solitude is very cool, and we can learn a lot more about ourselves doing that more extreme form of solitude. But actually, there's an everyday solitude that everybody has access to, that I think we can equally appreciate. And we've been talking about it in terms of sort of big S solitude. So big S solitude is like what the great intellectuals talk about, or religious or spiritual leaders. But we all have access to this little S solitude of, taking those moments to do our crafting, or whatever it is that gives us that sense that we're with ourselves.
And so I'm curious from you the difference. Like when we talk about little s solitude, which I do think is so important because there are these moments that you can steal throughout the day that really are quite kind of regenerative and recharging and deeply important for kind of centering oneself and for, just like experiencing something a little bit deeper, a little bit more profound. These moments of reading a book or knitting or baking a cake where you get to be sort of focused on one thing, or these moments where you sit and your mind is wandering a little bit more. What is sort of the difference, and I don't know if you want to take it neurologically or sociologically or whatever, between, let's say, sitting by yourself and, knitting and scrolling endlessly on social media? Because I think a lot of people actually have a ton of time in their day that they find themselves doing something that almost like mimics solitude. But I worry that scrolling on social media is just wildly different than baking a cake or coloring in your coloring book. Maybe I'm wrong. So I'm curious kind of what your take is on that phenomenon specifically.
Yeah. So again, I think we're learning a lot more about the different ways that we spend our solitude time and the different activities. Um, I think those kind of moments where we choose, okay, I'm going to sit alone and really reflect, or I'm going to distract myself with something that is a bit compulsive. Um, those decisions we make in our lives are really fascinating, both in terms of what leads us to want to just completely turn our brain off and take in media rather than engaging with ourselves a little bit more, and also how doing that disrupts the benefits that we can get from solitude. So I think what we find is, even when we're scrolling through social media, that's still solitude in a way. The way people sort of define where solitude ends and social begins is about active communication. So if you're kind of texting somebody or even putting up content on social media, you could argue then it starts to become a social interaction rather than solitude time. Having said that, there's different qualities of solitude time. And again, I think my value is to say we each find how to spend our time alone in the way that's most rewarding for us. So following that value, if somebody felt that scrolling through social media was a way that they felt really relaxed and like they learned a lot, then more power to them that they have that resource. But on the other hand, many of us are left feeling depleted, or maybe that we wasted our time. So the most important thing is actually to think, I have this time in my life or in my day. I have this 15 minutes or this half an hour. How do I want to use it? And when we start to think about solitude as a valuable time in our lives rather than the breaks between our social interactions or our responsibilities, or the time we're just cleaning ourselves or getting from one place to another in a car, when we start to think about that time as an opportunity, we can think, do I want to use that opportunity to be scrolling, or do I want to use that opportunity to understand my thoughts and feelings around some big thing that happened at work the other day, or what I would like my goals to be, or just to breathe and relax because I've been really stressed out.
Yeah, it's almost like what you're really describing is the fundamental kind of definition of mindfulness. It's being aware of the decisions that you're making and making them with intentionality, as opposed to sort of j- kind of having a series of just like reactivity, or like you use the word compulsiveness, which I think is a good word, that a lot of us feel like I didn't even realize I was picking up my phone and starting to scroll, and then before I know it, I've spent 15 minutes doing this. It's not what I wanted to do. I wasn't very present while I was doing it. It was more of a compulsion than it being intentional. And that's not to say, like you said, that all the time that we're on social media it's like that. The question is being able to recognize, are we engaging in something mindfully? Did I make this choice? And was I present versus was this sort of like a compulsion? And before I knew it, I felt like I had lost time.
Absolutely. And I think making the operative word here is choice. So I think making those choices and really choosing, what we know from the research is choosing solitude is already great. People really benefit more when they choose to be alone. They benefit in terms of feeling calm. They feel less stressed when they choose solitude, and we really get that sense of self connection and an empowerment from chosen solitude. So ideally, we choose to be in solitude, but also when we're in solitude, choosing what we're doing and really being intentional about it. We talk often about solitude as connecting with the self or aligning with the self in that positive way. It gives us the freedom to be choosing what we want to do the things that interest us, that we value. But we often forget to make these deliberate decisions about what we do value or what we do enjoy doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to kind of in some respects it's circling back, but in other respects it's opening up a new conversation, I think, about I just want to mention gender because I can't help but get away um from the way I've been unfortunately thinking about something lately, and that is this concept that you mentioned of choice, of engaging with the self. And, before you said something that really stuck out to me. It was like whether you're choosing to sit and think about that conflict you had at work, or you're thinking about your goals and there's a real intentionality to it, or whether you're sort of just distracting yourself. And I can't help but often see some gender differences, and there's obviously a huge amount of overlap. I have male clients and I have female clients, but I will say I tend to see more women in therapy. I tend to see more women and like non binary individuals or trans women in therapy than men in therapy. I tend to notice that women are often working on boundaries and they're often working on how to preserve more time for themselves, whereas men are often working more on empathy and compassion. But not all, this is not always the case. I don't think this has anything I personally don't think this is a biological thing by any stretch. I think that this has so much to do with how we're socialized and how we're raised. But the question for you, and I guess the thing I want to grapple with, is this sort of idea around the benefit of utilizing solitude. There are people who are afraid to be alone with their own thoughts. There are people who embrace um, the work that comes with being alone with your own thoughts. And I think I often take for granted the benefit. So we're sitting here talking, we're psychologists talking about, this, being really intentional and being really mindful. And these are all great things. But we haven't really, I think, dug deep into why they're good things. Like, what are the benefits of being intentional and sometimes facing some of the hard things, the anxieties that come with being alone with your thoughts versus kind of just constantly avoiding that inner monologue?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Sorry, it
So,
was so loaded with the gender stuff at the top. But
well, we can
I feel
we,
like I
we
just
can
had to get
circle
it out
back
there.
to that as
Okay, good.
well. When we look at solitude, it's not it. When you compare solitude and social time, solitude doesn't always come out the winner. People aren't always saying, solitude's always better for me, as compared to my social time. Um, but what solitude does tend to offer us is this opportunity to recenter and to feel a sense of calm and to have a sense of who we are. And so, when we think about our social interactions, we're spending a lot of time focusing on others, attending to others, being sensitive to their cues. So we're looking for their body language, we're hearing their tones of voice, we're thinking, what kinds of communications are happening right now that I can respond to? And we tend to play a role in a way. We tend to act out a part of, like, this is me as a partner or as a parent or as a friend, and we shift ourselves a little bit to be able to kind of be in that social interaction or to be at work and be professional. When we're alone, we pause all of that and we have a chance to just kind of return to ourselves. And one important benefit that research has highlighted is that when we can do that, we feel a sense of calm and peaceful affect, we call it. So when we look at to get kind of technical about it, when we look at mood and emotions, psychologists can think about mood. Often we'll talk about positive or negative affect or mood, like we might feel happy or sad. So often we'll simply talk about it as I feel positive or I feel negative affects or moods. But we also have high arousal mood and low arousal mood. So we can have sort of high arousal positive affect, which is I feel happy and excited. We can have a high arousal negative affect, like I feel anxious and angry. Or we can have low arousal positive affect, like I feel calm, or low arousal negative affect, like feeling sad. Solitude is very good for downregulating our high arousal emotions. So it makes us feel kind of less anxious and angry. It also makes us feel quite often less happy and excited. It's a place where calm happens. And I think we tend to forget about calm as an emotion we care about.
Yeah, we think of it as like the sort of the lack of emotion oftentimes. I think we think of it as almost like a not negative, I'm using the word wrong, but the opposite of emotion, but it's not. It in itself is an affective state.
It is, and it's one that's really powerful and can give us the energy within us to then return to that high arousal world that we live in. The world where we kind of really have to be on. And so, one of the main kind of superpowers of solitude is that it gives us in its finest state when we're really using it to our advantage, it gives us that sense of calm and peaceful affect that is harder to get in social situations. It gives us a chance to be creative as well and to have a sense of kind of freedom to do what we want. So there are opportunities that we can have in solitude that we don't have when we're in social interactions.
Yeah. But these kinds of things don't always come immediately or passively, right? Like there are examples in which somebody has to learn to be comfortable in those kinds of experiences, or that the sort of more they practice it, the better these positive outcomes. Because for many individuals, and you even see this when you're kind of in psychotherapy, you think about how, okay, mindful meditation, this is a great intervention for a lot of things. It's great for anxiety. Well, not always, because for some people, engaging in mindful meditation without a lot of support can be incredibly anxiety inducing. And they almost have to work through that to get to the place where it is relaxing and calming and helps promote some of those positive outcomes. So what about the individuals for whom sitting in solitude is overwhelmingly anxiety inducing? Is there hope that that is a transitional state, that they can get to a place where there are benefits that come from it?
Yeah. Yeah, I have no data to speak to this, but I I like to think so. And I think it's kind of practicing and familiarity that might get us there. But I guess one important thing to highlight is that solitude doesn't need to be transformative and meditative and spiritual. And me personally, I really like watching television, and I've used television to overcome particularly lonely moments in my past. And I think when we look at people who struggle to be in this kind of more thoughtful solitude, things like television, other distractions are not necessarily always a bad thing. We have found that, especially young adults, so adults in their 20s, they really don't love the sitting alone with their thoughts for long periods of time. But they really benefit from these kind of more passive entertainment options where they're still in solitude, but they're being distracted. And actually, we found in experiments that if we stress young adults out and then we either leave them alone with their thoughts or we let them watch a television show, that in general, there are no costs at all to watching a television show. And actually, those people who got to watch television felt more relaxed and more peaceful after the fact than those who sat alone with their thoughts. So I think there are times in solitude where being really alone with our thoughts means that we ruminate
Of
and
course,
that
yeah.
we're hard on ourselves and that we're unproductive in the way that we're thinking about things. And then, that can be something we might challenge ourselves to see if we can work through some of that. But doing too much of that could very well backfire. And I wouldn't prescribe sort of the spiritual forms of solitude for long periods. I wouldn't send people out to kind of practice being hermits if that's not something that they felt they wanted to do or would be good for them. I think there are a lot of ways for us to have our solitude time.
Yeah, it definitely does seem like like you mentioned before, a balance is necessary. And I think my biggest concern, and maybe it's just one that I see a lot sort of living in this very modern capitalist society, is the extreme other end of that. The individuals who, the sort of workaholism of modern society, the individuals who can't or don't feel that doing nothing is productive enough, and they constantly want to fill their time with productivity. I worry about the consequences of that and the lack of emotional regulation that kind of comes from the anxiety of sitting alone, and again, like you mentioned, you don't want to kind of prescribe forced meditation on somebody because that could backfire pretty heavily. But I do worry about the sort of extreme other end of it. You've got your Buddhas over here, and then you've got your individuals who just like cannot fathom spending any downtime and feeling like I'm wasting time. I need to be productive, productive, productive. When there is so much that can come from taking a minute to breathe.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think in our modern lives, we are often kept busy. Things are loud for us. There's a lot going on, especially those of us who live in urban environments and cities where there are noises and there's action and we're doing things and we have deadlines and lists. I think we can be always on in a way that is not particularly good for us in the long run. And some of the research in solitude is actually just about that and how, taking the time to slow down is in itself really important, and how having space to just be in quiet. There's a really fascinating new literature on quietude, and that idea that the quiet on the outside and reflects the quiet on the inside, and that in kind of spaces where our senses aren't overwhelmed anymore, we can also have a little bit more peace inside. So I think that there's that busyness and the stress of everyday life where slowing down and being able to take a moment to just think can make a big difference. And one of the people that I got to talk to when I was writing the book, David Vincent, he's a historian and he studied the history of solitude, and he has some really wonderful, interesting ideas about solitude and how our relationships with solitude have been formed by our history. But one of the things he said is that historically, people, and especially men, but people always had a moment for solitude. Even if you were really busy, you could kind of pause. And let's say you were a farmer and you were responsible for a lot of things, but then you could pause and kind of just look out in the distance for some time. That even today, we will take our dog on a walk, and if that's the only thing that we do that is our solitude time, and we might not even think of it as solitude time, we might think of it as we're doing the responsible thing of taking our dog on a walk, that those moments are really, really important for us to be able to stop and just think or reflect for a little while. It doesn't have to be sort of setting aside the time and sitting down staring at the wall and just thinking. Although for those of us who are very busy, that could also be an attractive way to spend time. But going for a walk and having that time to just look at what's immediately around us can in itself be a very important part of us regulating our emotions.
And I think that that point, that emotion regulation piece of it is so important. It's reducing reactivity and kind of increasing equanimity within ourselves, that calm, that thing that often is talked about as a lack of affect, but it's really a fundamentally important sort of affect. Just being comfortable, being calm, feeling safe, that can come from solitude if we use it the way that we want to use it. And I think that point that you made multiple times throughout our interview is such an important point, which is that we are individuals and we can't really prescribe a one size fits all solution, that we have to do what's best and what's right for us. And maybe we don't know what that is. And maybe that's the exploration that we're doing in reading books like yours and in seeking therapy, is learning how to find balance and learning, well, what is right for me? But really being true to yourself and listening to yourself and realizing that you are an individual and, your choices are your own, I think is such an important sort of takeaway here. So I'm curious from you. As we kind of wind this down, is there anything, I mean, there's probably a million things we didn't get to, but is there anything that you want to mention that we didn't get to that you would, be remiss if we didn't kind of mention on the show before we sign off?
I think we covered kind of a lot of what's important to me within kind of understanding solitude and what the research is showing us. I think what we're learning more and more is that there isn't a one size fits all solitude experience. There are different forms of solitude and different activities we could do when we're alone, and there isn't the right amount of time where we can now say we've successfully done solitude as a thing. So even if we take a few moments to be alone, that's already great. Uh, I think the important thing is that if we can each reflect on what we value in our solitude time and how we want to spend that time, we're going to be spending time in solitude, whether we like it or not, and whether we intend to do something with it or not. So, what we're seeing in terms of numbers is that a third of adults are spending, I'm sorry, let me say that a different way, which is what we're seeing in terms of numbers is that about a third of our waking time is spent in solitude across days. For older adults, it's more, it's about half of our waking time. Even teenagers are around a quarter. So we're all having solitude. We're all engaging in solitude in our daily lives. And if we kind of don't stop and reflect, well, what could I do with this time that would make my day just a little bit better? We, I think, lose that opportunity. And what we're finding is solitude really does offer us a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, I've got to say, this was a really enlightening chat. I spent a whole hour not in solitude, talking with you and really digging deep. And I hope that those listening, especially those, well, I would say across the board, those who struggle with their alone time and want it to be more maybe meaningful, but also those like me who really enjoy their solitude and have been curious about the research behind, like there's that level of like, I know I like this and it feels like it's good for me, but I'm curious, like, what does the science say? I think, across the board, there's so much for everybody because we are all people and we all spend time with ourselves. So there's so much for everybody here in the book. It's called Solitude, the Science and Power of Being Alone. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk early.